Meeting is now being recorded.
Good afternoon or good morning to everyone. My name is Jen Cattell and I'm the Director of Logistics and Speaker Relations for the Insights Association. Welcome to today's webinar, Upgrading Your Online Consumer Surveys. Before I introduce today's presenters, just a few housekeeping items I would like to mention. This call is being recorded. All participants are defaulted to the listen-only mode so that your background noise cannot be heard. Just in case, please mute your phones at this time to ensure there's no interruptions during the presentation. Today's webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes. There will be a Q&A session held at the end of the presentation. To ask questions, please type your comments into the questions pod on the toolbar. We will try our best to get to everyone's questions. Today's speakers are David Dutwin, Michael Dennis, and Angela Fontes. David is NORC's Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives within the Business Ventures and Innovation Department. David provides scientific and programmatic thought leadership in support of NORC's ongoing innovations, ensuring work is disseminated throughout the scientific community. He is also the Chief Scientist of AmeriSpeak, NORC's multi-client panel-based research platform. He is an avid member and past president of APOR, lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania, and a research scholar at the Institute for Jewish and Community Research. Michael is a Senior Vice President in NORC's Business Ventures and Innovation Unit and Executive Director of AmeriSpeak. Michael oversees all of AmeriSpeak operations, including business development and panel recruitment. Michael has authored more than 60 articles, conference and seminar papers, and book chapters. He is a frequent speaker at annual meetings for APOR, a nationally recognized expert on survey research methods with a particular focus on online surveys and household panels. Angela is the Director of Behavioral and Economic Analysis and Decision-Making Program Area at NORC at the University of Chicago. She oversees academic, foundation, and commercial research focused on economic decision-making and consumer behavior. Angela is the principal investigator on several projects, including a 5-year contract with the Securities and Exchange Commission to conduct investor protection research. She is an adjunct faculty at the Northwestern University and teaches graduate courses in behavioral economics and public policy, policy analysis, and predictive analytics. Angela is also on the board of directors of the American Council on Consumer Interest and the Northwest Side Housing Center. I will turn the presentation over to Michael, Angela, and David.
Very good. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for making time for our webinar today. And thank you to the Insights Association for hosting this event. This is Mike Dennis at NORC. And for our content today, we have, first of all, a short presentation of the research problem that we're trying to tackle here, followed by David Dutwin's synopsis of the opportunity here for everyone who's attending the call today, followed by our methodological discussion and description of our TrueNorth methodology for combining probability and non-probability samples that will also be addressed by David Dutwin. And then afterwards, we do have 2 data-driven case studies for you today, the first of which will be presented by Angela Fontes, that is examining financial services and financial-related consumer behavior using our TrueNorth methodology. And then another case study, this time presented by David Dutwin, looking at consumer behavior, particularly consumer purchasing behavior, often of low-cost goods and some higher-priced goods. And then finally, I'll come back to talk just very briefly about future research directions, and we generally look forward to the questions that you'll be submitting and making time for that. So with respect to the research problem, we appreciate that market researchers conducting consumer surveys are seeking accuracy and reliability in their surveys while working with limited budgets for the actual data collection. In addition to data collection costs, market researchers need to factor in their own or other cost inputs, such as the cost for research design, analytics, and reporting. The result is pressure felt by market researchers to keep the cost of the data collection down so that we can legitimately do our analytics and reporting to our client satisfaction. So as market researchers, we all know that we often rely on inexpensive, non-probability opt-in consumer samples for the data collection. And these are the sources of sample that are familiar to all of you in our webinar today. These are interviews that can cost less than $10 per interview, or even less than $5 per interview, and sometimes only $2 per interview or less if just doing general population consumer surveys. The good part is that these opt-in samples are fast and cost-effective. The less than good part, however, is that these opt-in samples have been shown to be less accurate than surveys conducted with probability samples. Researchers sometimes legitimately worry whether the results from the opt-in samples are giving them accurate information. So the question in short is this: is there a third way for market researchers to get their consumer surveys done with more accuracy than just relying on non-probability opt-in samples, while doing so cost effectively? This gets to our proposal: how NORC can help market researchers with their consumer research. NORC at the University of Chicago has been in business almost 80 years, and we are well known for our scientific rigor and impartiality. Just over 5 years ago, almost to the day, we added AmeriSpeak to NORC's toolkit for surveys. AmeriSpeak is a probability-based panel. Our prices for clients using AmeriSpeak are comparable to the prices of other probability panels. But our key differentiator, and we're very proud of it, is that our response rate is much higher than the response rate of other panels. At more than 30%, our APOR response rate at that panel recruitment stage, as the first stage of building the panel, it is multiples higher than any other panel available in the U.S. to market researchers. We are the only panel available for consumer research that uses in-person, face-to-face interviewers during the panel recruitment stage of recruiting the households to the panel and impaneling those households, helping AmeriSpeak include consumer segments that are underrepresented in other panels. And we encourage visiting our website to look at the empirical demonstrations of that last statement. In short, the answer is, and David Dutwin will elaborate much more, is that there is an NORC way. And today we are sharing with you research that we've been doing that we believe will result in a solution that can meet your research requirements of lower costs, larger sample sizes, and more accuracy and reliability in the information. So at this point, I'll hand it over to my colleague, David Dutwin, for the presentation of the research opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. I think the best place to start is really to summarize, maybe in graphical form, the relative cost quality metric of different types of options for research. For those who've done market research, this may look like a similar two-dimensional graph you would see for example, a key driver analysis, which you usually want your key driver analysis to have the sweet spot in the upper right quadrant. But here we actually like the lower right quadrant, where you have data of the highest quality, but also for the lowest possible cost. Of course, we all know telephone methodologies are getting more and more expensive as years go by with call spamming and blocking. So while current research conducted by myself and a number of other colleagues find that data quality of telephonic research is still very high, the costs are just exploding. Folks have turned to address-based samples as an option. And of course, as Mike mentioned, the AmeriSpeak is an excellent option in terms of very high data quality. One of the things I was really surprised at when I came here is I always knew that AmeriSpeak had this door-to-door non-response follow-up. What I was really surprised to find out is that somewhere around half the panelists end up being recruited that way. So it's not like a small little catching the crumbs. It's really a major feature of the panel and really leads to an amazingly high-quality panel. But of course, at the end of the day, market researchers still often have price points, even demanding even lower price points. And so, again, our TrueNorth calibration is an option that we think fits into this lower right quadrant of very high data quality with low respective costs. So I think that the place to start is just to talk about non-probability a little bit and to discuss why it's important, why the TrueNorth methodology is what it is based on what we know about non-probability research. And I want to be very clear. I think myself, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience today and a lot of people in this room, we've all used non-probability panels for research. I'm certainly not here to demote them in some way, but and certainly there are some research, typically in second, third tier non-peer reviewed journals, that do show some accuracy. Non-probability panels have on occasion done well in elections, but all the first tier peer-reviewed journal articles that are out there that really do serious research on non-probability find two things. They find, number one, that estimates can often be under or overinflated, and number two, that there's a high variance of estimation. I think really the best example of this was the Advertising Research Foundations for Quality study. And this is just one example on the screen where they grabbed the benchmark. CDC finds at the time of the survey about 17.5% of the U.S. Being defined as smokers. They did a telephonic probability sample that got about 18.5%, not shown on this graph. And then they fielded this question across 17 different non-probability panel providers, and you can see the results here. The results range from 19 to 33%. The median, let's say, is 26, 27%. So you have a median almost 10 percentage points higher, 50% higher than the actual true gold standard estimate established by the CDC. But the real fear is the variance in these estimates. When you hire a non-probability panel provider, you don't know if you're hiring panel A or panel Q. And that's the real fear, is that you don't know that. And so if you happen to have hired panel Q and you're going to use that, as your official estimate, you're going to really head down the wrong path. So our TrueNorth calibration tool is a combination of three elements. It pulls in the probability chassis of AmeriSpeak. It leverages non-probability opt-in samples for cost savings, and then uses NORC's proprietary calibration using small area estimation to merge these two data together into a highly accurate final product. Just to note, it says here opt-in A, B, and C. In the case studies we present coming up, they all gathered data from 3 different panel providers. Just for simplicity of presentation, we average them together so that you're not seeing dozens of bars on every chart. But suffice to say, we found very similar results that the ARF found, significant variance across the 3 panels, and typically a pretty significant bias in each of the point estimates. But okay, let's get to what TrueNorth is and how it works. And again, I think the best place to start is to explain the underlying problem with non-probability samples. So you have here an oval that represents the U.S. population. And panel providers typically develop partnerships with various folks. So a given panel might have a partnership with an airline miles program. And so they reach out, they email, they recruit people that belong to a given airline mile program to be part of the panel. They may recruit from people who hold credit cards for a given sports store, or they may throw some banner advertisements out on the internet to gather more recruits. Maybe video game store rewards holders, maybe folks who shop in a typical online brand name clothing store. But you see the pattern that's going on here, and that is that if non-probability panels are biased, they're biased based on attitudinal and behavioral metrics. They're not biased necessarily on demographic metrics. And in fact, research study after research study shows that panels can be very accurate demographically, and yet still have very inaccurate attitudinal and behavioral metrics. So wouldn't it be nice if we could calibrate the data to the attitudinal and behavioral metrics? The problem is the panel providers don't willingly provide information on who their recruiting partners are. That's proprietary intellectual property on their part. I totally get it. But we can't, wouldn't it be nice if we knew who these recruiting sources were? We could then maybe make some sort of direct adjustments to fix them. Ultimately, we have multiple different recruiters building into a panel, and the hope would be that all of these various recruiters would ultimately blanket the U.S. population, but it's never really the case. And as you can see here, there's significant gaps. Some of the gaps might be, well, certainly internet panels don't cover people who don't have the internet. This is not an insignificant issue. It's somewhere between 10 and 13% of the U.S. population. Maybe if the panel recruits from a lot of travel programs, it has a significant gap in non-travelers. So if you do a survey of travel behavior, you're going to get very biased results. And the real problem is we really don't know where the gaps are. So the TrueNorth methodology is designed, number one, to combine the two samples so that we have blanket coverage, and then ultimately to smooth out the discolorations here, if you will, to be able to provide a true flat coverage of the U.S. population through the combination of the two samples. So how is this done? Well, the key, again, getting back to those attitudinal and behavioral metrics, we now know from what I explained earlier that you really need to be able to figure out ways, since we don't know the attitudinal and behavioral skews from the original panel recruitment, all we really have left is the data at hand on a given survey. So we have to be able to find a way to fix, we know that there's going to be attitudinal and behavioral bias, how do we fix it? And it's really about choosing variables to select for advanced calibration. So here I have another sort of key driver-esque plot. On the horizontal axis, you have the difference between the probability and the non-probability estimate. Think about that ARF example for smoking, where the probability might be 18%, the non-probability might be 28%. And then on the vertical axis, you have the interconnectedness of all the variables in the data set. And this is an important metric as well, because if we pick a variable that's low here, this star is represented by few interconnectivities. If you correct for the bias of this purple variable, you're not going to really correct for the bias in other variables in the data set. Whereas if you correct for this orange variable here, there's lots of interconnectedness, and that's really going to solve the problem throughout the entire data set. Another way to just show it very quickly, if you calibrate to this purple variable, sure, you're going to fix that purple variable, but you're really not going to fix any of the other variables because this purple variable is low in its interconnectivity to all other variables in the data set. Even if you pick a variable that's very high in interconnectivity, well, you can see this blue bar has very low bias because it's on the left end of the plot. So again, it's not really going to do much. Even when you have high differences between probability and non-probability, if you have low interconnectivity, same sort of deal. That variable, if you fix that variable, it's not going to do much to fix the rest of the data. But then you have this sweet spot where you have a variable that's both high in the difference between the probability and non-probability estimate, and also high in its interconnectivity to all other variables in the data set. And if you're able to scientifically calibrate that variable, by proxy, you're going to fix the bias across the full range of the data set. So I'll just end with a quick description of the process. So we have our two samples, probability and non-probability. These two sets of samples go into a machine learning process. This machine learning process figures out the dimensions of that plot in the last screen. It figures out how, to what degree variables differ in their probability and non-probability estimates. It figures out the interconnectivity of variables to all other variables in the data set. And it spits out basically the best predictors, the best candidates for calibration. There may be one, two, probably at most three. But again, the goal here is to recognize, hey, non-probability is biased based on attitudinal and behavioral metrics. If we can fix the most important attitudinal and behavioral metric in a given data set, we go a long way in reducing the bias. So that gets fed into a small area model, and I won't get too much into the details just to keep things flowing here. But suffice to say, this is actually a really important feature of the TrueNorth process. I've seen other sorts of procedures that basically just do straight raking in a hybrid fashion. But with this small area model, You have basically the development of point estimates across, in this example, 48 different point estimates across the dimensions of race, age, gender, and education. And there's really two important points I just want to make quickly here. The first is that one of the nice features is that while I'm showing these 4 variables here, we actually use 16 candidate variables and go through a process to figure out the best 3 or 4 or maybe 5 variables to go into the small area domain. So it's not fixed. It's something we sort of custom build each time we're working on a study. But the real important element to the small area model, I think, is that without the small area model, you can enact a similar sort of procedure here and successfully reduce bias across the data set overall, but still have really significant biases when you start drilling down in the small subgroups. With the small area model, that's really custom built to solve that problem and to be able to give researchers the confidence that when they break it down to just Hispanics or just people who rent their homes or what have you, you're going to have accurate results down at that lower level of data. So at the end of the day, the small area model gets put into a ranking procedure. Census demographic benchmarks also get added to the mix. And ultimately, we end up with our TrueNorth calibrated combined non-probability and probability product. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on to have Angela talk about a case study.
Sure. Thanks, David. So as was mentioned in the introductions, my name is Angela Fontes. I oversee a team of expert researchers, and we study a lot of things related to personal finance, investor decision-making, and we work with a lot of financial services institutions as clients, helping them think through everything from deep understanding of consumer preferences to product design, sort of everything in between. And I will also say we've been an AmeriSpeak user, I think, from practically day one. And so we are super, super excited to add TrueNorth to our toolbox because as Mike mentioned, I think we face 2 issues sometimes with working with our market research clients. One, often we just don't have the budget to be able to afford a true, pure AmeriSpeak sample. The other thing that we often face, and I'll mention it in one of the use case studies that I'll talk about, is that we are looking at really small, very specific market segments, and often we need to sort of leverage as much sample as we can to get an N that makes sense for analytics. So I want to talk about sort of 4 variables that we've been looking at and have been really useful in thinking about how we plan to use TrueNorth. And they're all related, of course, to this idea of financial services. We have been studying quite a bit of investor decision-making and working with a couple of our clients to really understand how consumers and investors are making decisions about which investments to own. And one of the fundamental concepts related to investor decision-making is risk. And so when we have used opt-in panels in the past, one of the challenges has been that we see really different metrics when we compare even population estimates to benchmarks that we know are versions of the truth that we can count on. This question is the first one I want to talk about. This is a really traditional risk tolerance question. And what's nice about some of the things that we're looking at is we do have national benchmarks with really high quality, primarily federal data. So here, we're looking at the Survey of Consumer Finances, and when we ask this question about how much risk are you willing to take, we see that about 20% of the population indicates they're willing to take substantial or above average risk. So when we sit down with one of our financial services clients, particularly when we're thinking around investments, this is a critical item for us to know about all of our markets that we're looking to either design a product for or better understand. Unfortunately, when we look at this same prevalence in an opt-in sample, we see that actually 32% indicate that they're in this really high risk tolerance group. Unfortunately, if this is the only information we have, we could consult with our clients and lead them to develop a product that incorporates a lot of risk, thinking that our market is tolerant of that, when in fact that's not the case. What's great about the TrueNorth estimate, and you can see that here, using the TrueNorth methodology, we're at just over 25% in that top 2 box, is that it accounts for the difference in the samples, but still in a way that we're able to accommodate within our budget and apply sort of the rigor that I think NORC is known for. When we look at the errors, and I think these charts, I'll show you one of these for all the variables I'm talking about, this is really compelling. When we compare the opt-in sample to the benchmarks from the Survey of Consumer Finances, we see that there's a 12% difference here. The other thing I think that's really interesting about this table, and we'll see the same pattern repeated in a number of the items we're looking at, is that traditional weighting, which we often think is sort of intended to overcome some of the challenges related to an opt-in sample, is really almost negligible impact here. We see, what, a 0.2% change in this error. With the TrueNorth methodology, we get down to under 5%, essentially cutting that error in half, which is really ideal. Another item related to risk is this understanding of how consumers or investors recognize risk. So this is actually a question that is part of a larger financial literacy battery, but really gets to the heart of how an investor might recognize risk. So we want to understand how they're tolerating risk, but also their ability to sort of perceive risk. The question is a simple true-false. Buying a single company stock provides a safer return than a stock market mutual fund. And we know, everyone knows, it's not a test. The correct answer is false, right? That it is not, in fact, safer. And when we look at the national benchmarks, sort of the gold standard of data, we know that just under 80%, 78.5% of investors, consumers here, indicate the correct answer, which is false. When we look at opt-in samples, and this is striking to me, we see that only about 2/3 of our sample is actually answering this correctly. This is telling us that we have a population that is not recognizing risk in the same way. And again, were we to base conclusions or sort of data-driven decision advice on this single metric based on the opt-in sample, we would really be providing some misleading advice. TrueNorth, and I want to go ahead and go over to the error bar chart here because I think this is so compelling. When we look at that, again, comparison between the national benchmark and the opt-in sample, we see almost 14% difference in those two estimates. Weighting has a negligible impact. So when we weight that opt-in sample, we see just under 12% error. But when we apply the TrueNorth methodology, and this is one of the most striking results in the work that we've done so far, we get to an error that is about 0.5%, which is really compelling. These two, simply these two variables, these two concepts are incredibly meaningful. If we take these two together, if we were to use only an opt-in sample, we know we'd be dramatically overestimating consumers' willingness to take risk and dramatically underestimating their understanding. When we sit down to talk about financial services products, these are really critical, and I'm just thrilled that TrueNorth is a great tool for us in adding some rigor to our results. I want to talk about two other ideas, and really these are more around scoping a market and trying to understand what the actual size of a market segment might be. We do some tracking, and we're always interested in the new trends in financial services, and online banking is an obvious one here. And so we wanted to understand and look at differences between national benchmarks, and here we're pulling data from a recent survey by the FDIC, telling us about 63% of consumers are using some kind of online banking to manage their finances. When we ask the same question to our opt-in panels, we see a dramatic difference in the proportion of individuals using online banking, 50% TrueNorth supports and helps us get to those national benchmarks. So when we apply the TrueNorth methodology, we get to about 60%. And again, looking at those errors, a difference of 13.5% when we don't weight, we get a marginal reduction in that error, about 1%. But when we apply that TrueNorth methodology, we get down to an error that is less than 3%, which is really ideal. Again, we want to look at what the demand for online banking is. This is really critical information for us. Finally, one last one. An area that I'm particularly interested in is generating and working with our financial services clients to develop products for individuals who may not be banked or potentially underbanked. This is a small population, and so getting good estimates around this population and collecting data with unbanked individuals can be a challenge. When we look at FDIC data, we see that about 6.5% of Americans indicate that they have not had some kind of bank account in the last 12 months. So this is, again, a small population. In our recent data collection with opt-in panels, we see almost 3 times as many individuals indicating that they did not have some kind of bank account, which is an astonishing difference here. TrueNorth methodology, again, same story, really helps to kind of make sure our estimates are effective. Let me show you the errors on this. We see about a 10.5% error, very small reduction when we apply the weighting when comparing the benchmark data, again coming from FDIC, to our opt-in panels. And we're able to cut that error in by about half, right, when we are using the TrueNorth methodology. And just in terms of scoping a market, 10% may not actually seem like that much, but when we're looking at actual market size, about 35 million people who we would misclassify as our target audience for a product if we were to only use this opt-in sample. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about a few of the use cases we're super excited to be working with AmeriSpeak and using TrueNorth on. And David, I think you're going to talk about some additional use cases related to consumer purchasing.
Yes, thank you. There have been a number of studies here at NORC that have looked at a range of different consumer behaviors, be it financial or purchases, et cetera. I want to focus on some purchase behavior in some of the case studies here. Specifically, I'll show you some examples from food product purchases, from car purchases, and beverage purchases, and these are all from data of the general population 18 plus. So the first example, we measured intent to purchase a new car or a used car in the next 12 months. This example is specific to new car. Just for simplicity's sake, used car really the same sort of patterns here. This will be pretty familiar to you now after Angela. Really kind of similar results. This one really kind of made me pause a little bit in the sense of the amount of error here, because again, if you're a car manufacturer, you're likely using a lot of different data to determine the next year. You're going to look at historical purchase data. You're going to look at the health of the market, but you're also going to look at survey data to estimate what you think the next year is going to hold for purchases. If you have a very rosy outlook, maybe you're going to start building up future hiring, even adding additional capacity from internally in plants or adding another plant. So this is a very consequential question. And as you can see, the opt-in error is about 14%. Typically, again, traditional demographic weighting doesn't make much of a difference, and the TrueNorth error is very small. When you put this in context of the point estimate, this is what really is kind of shocking, is that the opt-in estimate is almost precisely double the actual benchmark, which if put into real practice in terms of hiring and capacity, would really get a manufacturer into some pretty serious trouble. The TrueNorth estimate, again, within the margin of error, a little bit higher than the benchmark, but certainly well within the margin. We also looked at beverage purchase behavior. So here, it's very typical, of course, across a range of areas of business to want to know how your competitors are doing. You may have obviously, you're going to have very good data on your own amount of sales, but you're not going to have great data on your competitors. Very typical then to do competitive analysis through surveys. So here's an example of trying to measure purchase behavior on various beverages, in this case Mountain Dew, Fanta, and 7-Up in the last 12 months. The weighted error here, I've kind of just simplified. I think we now know that weighting by demographics isn't really going to do much, so I just limit this to the weighted error. About a little under 10% across these three beverages. The TrueNorth error all under 2% in each. When we look at the point estimates, what this translates into again is that if you had gone with the opt-in estimate alone, you would make an assumption that your competitors were selling about a third more than they actually had. And the TrueNorth error is not only within the margin, but in the case of Mountain Dew, almost spot on, identical to the benchmark. And of course, we can't continue talking about different purchases without talking about the trouble of truffles. So, truffle purchase in the last 12 months, and I have to, I don't know what it is about truffles, like the last 3 restaurants I've gone to, it's been all about truffles. So this is not an inconsequential metric. We have a whopping 3 times as much error in the opt-in estimate, 18% compared to the benchmark of 6% for purchasing truffles in the last 12 months. The TrueNorth is, again, in the high 6s, less than 1% error. And this truffles was part of a battery of food purchases, products that people had purchased in the last 12 months. Typically, this battery was particular to allergy impacts, so questions like almond oil, vanilla extract, and truffles, et cetera. And across all of these metrics, the average error was about 8%, and again, TrueNorth gets it down to within the margin. So again, across all of these metrics, you really have a similar kind of story. The non-probability panels can really lead you down the wrong path, and TrueNorth typically gets you back into the margin of the benchmark. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Mike.
Very good. Thank you, David, and thank you, Angela. We'll be opening it up to questions momentarily. In terms of any final remarks, we believe that we've created a product here in TrueNorth that is an advance on previous approaches, certainly an advance on our approaches that we've had here on AmeriSpeak, about how to extend the capability of AmeriSpeak so that this product can be more relevant to the consumer market research community. And I believe that we've established in the presentation today that we have an approach here that can provide a cost-effective solution to the market research community that is attempting to have highly accurate data at a reasonable price point. And that is the summary of our presentation today. And I'll be happy as a group here to take any specific questions. And before we do so, I do want to alert everyone that we did set up a web page in the last day to support our TrueNorth product. And you can see additional information now by visiting our TrueNorth page, including a white paper on the consumer purchasing behavior case study that David Dutwin presented today. There you can find the detailed statistical tables and our summary of the results there.
Thank you. For this final portion, we're now going to take questions. Just a reminder to everybody, please use the chat box to submit your questions. First question. The financial services case study showed that TrueNorth can help survey small populations. Can it be used for small geographical areas such as cities or zip codes?
Yeah, and I will start with an answer, but also look to my colleague David to speak more about that. The same type of approach that we're using here for calibration can also be used for small area estimation. And so there is a use case where we can apply the same types of techniques to get to the data that I think you are asking about, question asker. David, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. If we know that that's a particular interest of the researcher to be able to drill down geographically, we would really make sure that the small area model had some sort of geographical constraints, be it division or population density or some combination of those. And so that would really go a long way in ensuring that you'd have confidence in the metrics at the sub-national level.
And it's a great question because we know as fintech continues to develop, geography becomes important, and that is a very important conversation. So thank you for the question.
All right, next question. Do you calculate a margin of error or other metric of precision for surveys using the TrueNorth method?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's certainly something that I think industry-wide folks really struggle with, whether it's sheer non-probability research or some combination of probability and non-probability. We have provided margins where we have essentially taken a more conservative approach, and so the margins tend to be a little bit larger just to be safe. And we are presently working on trying to present a real more standard metric. Again, this is something that I think the industry, frankly, for almost a decade now has struggled with trying to get some uniformity in some sort of estimate that we can all agree to. But we're certainly, now that we have this product, really trying to take that seriously and develop something a little bit more refined and specific. And so hopefully, look forward in the year or two to come for us to be able to present something more specific.
Thank you. Next question. Do the variables that are selected to adjust the weighting for the opt-in sample vary each time?
Yes, the variables that go into the small area model, we have a pool of about 16 different candidate variables that we explore and look to see which ones would be significant drivers of the particular attitudinal or behavioral metric that we're trying to model. And so it's a little bit of again, a customized balancing act from study to study. We'll pick out the 3 or 4 best predictors and put them in the model. And it also depends on sample size. The larger the sample size, the more variables you can put in. But the small area model, it's like in the example in the presentation, there were 48 separate domains. So given a sample size of 1,000, 2,000, that's perfectly appropriate. If you have a sample size larger, you can add even more variables and more domains. So it really is sort of a customized process.
Next question. Have you tried making comparisons between TrueNorth and pure opt-in panels with more policy, political, or ideological questions?
So we have actually compared the AmeriSpeak results to healthcare and health policy items here to the non-probability opt-in sample results. And we do have a case study that we can share upon request that has those results, among other items. We will also be conducting 4 different tests this year, empirical tests. So in addition to the 2 that we presented today, we have 4 more in the pipeline, and one of them will be focused on health policy issues. So we would invite you to come back to our webpage throughout the year, and we'll be notifying the community when those are ready.
Next question, which is a 2-part question. Can you tell us more about the AmeriSpeak panel, the ones you use to help calibrate these results against? Why are the response rates so high, for example?
Yes, with respect to AmeriSpeak, the response rates that we see in our panel recruitment stage, so it's the very first stage of inviting households to join the panel probabilistically. The higher response rate we see on AmeriSpeak compared to other panels is entirely attributable to NORC's field interviewers who, quote, do door-to-door or face-to-face visits with the randomly selected households. And this is a two-stage recruitment process. Those initially randomly selected households are invited to join AmeriSpeak and contacted through a series of mailings and telephone-based outreach. After that first stage, we identify the non-responders to that stage, and we subsample those non-responders for the face-to-face contact. It is because of that face-to-face contact that we see approximately a 5.5 times increase in our APOR response rate, so that it exceeds 30% in all years where we've done the face-to-face recruitment. Thank you for the question.
Next question. Have you had any problems getting TrueNorth studies accepted by scientific peer reviewers or by media outlets?
We welcome the question. We've had, so far, so good is the short answer. In January 2019, the very first study that we used TrueNorth for was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It is in the January 4th, 2019 JAMA Network Open with the lead author Rushi Gupta. And that particular project involved a collection of over 50,000 interviews, a combination of non-probability and opt-in, to estimate food-specific allergy prevalence rates, many of which had very low prevalence rates, necessitating the very large sample sizes in order to be statistically precise in the prevalence rate calculations. I'll also mention that the TrueNorth approach is the statistical backbone for the Associated Press VoteCast project, the first unveiling of which was for the November 2018, the last midterm elections we had, where the AP VoteCast methodology was used for doing state-level predictions of voter turnout and the actual results of those midterm elections. And we've had a number of other successes as well with the Sesame Workshop, the Sesame Street's 50th anniversary celebration last year, and Harbor Freight Tools for Schools, and so on.
Thank you. Next question. What is the typical size of an AmeriSpeak panel sample used to calibrate a non-probability sample? Does it vary much between studies?
Yes, it certainly can. The real key is to ensure that there's a good critical mass within the probability sample, the AmeriSpeak sample. A theoretical minimum is about 250 interviews, but we really take a look at the cross-section of that 250 to make sure it's healthy. There's not a lot of bias compared to census benchmarks. If there is a little bit of bias, we might recommend a little bit more. And then on the non-probability side, really at the end of the day, the sky's the limit. I mean, you can have a 50-50 study where it's half probability, half non-probability, but as long as you have a good, healthy, minimal probability chassis on the probability side, you can literally gather thousands and even tens of thousands of non-probability interviews to calibrate. It's certainly something that we're always happy to talk shop about. If there's a particular application in mind, we can talk through the possibilities.
Thank you. Next question. Has the Office of Management and Budget approved any studies that utilize TrueNorth?
Yeah.
No problem. I'll repeat the question. Has the Office of Management and Budget approved any studies that utilize TrueNorth?
The short answer is that we do have OMB packages in front of OMB now that are using the TrueNorth approach as the statistical foundation. There is one study thus far that has obtained that approval, and we'll be happy to share that information when requested.
Next question. can you tell us more about the typical project schedule for a TrueNorth project?
Yeah, very good question. We welcome the opportunity to talk about project schedules and explain our flexibility on that point. The main trade-off as we see it is that the non-probability panels, I think as all of us know, have very short field periods typically, oftentimes even 1 day or 2 days, etc. Our feeling is that to obtain a representative sample from AmeriSpeak so that we can do an adequate job of calibrating the non-probability samples, we do request our clients to give us at least an extra 7 to 10 business days or calendar days for us to collect the additional data from AmeriSpeak to assure sample representativeness. So in general, we're looking for about 1 to 2 extra weeks on the project schedule compared to your doing the study with just a non-probability opt-in sample.
Next question. Where can we learn more about the financial services application of the TrueNorth methodology?
Sure, happy to answer that question. I think we've provided both the email address for TrueNorth in general, but you're very welcome to contact me personally, and my email address is there on the last page, fontes-angela@NORC, and always happy to have a conversation around applications of TrueNorth in financial services.
Next question. How does the cost of a TrueNorth study compare to a standard non-probability study?
Good question. Compared to using our AmeriSpeak only option, the costs for using TrueNorth are substantially lower than using simply AmeriSpeak. And moreover, we are seeing our costs come down quite a bit this year for our TrueNorth studies, and we expect them to keep coming down as we scale the TrueNorth operation and fine-tune our calibration weighting routine. The ultimate price we charge, as you would expect, is obviously dependent on study-specific factors, especially by the point that David Dutwin mentioned earlier, which comes down to how many AmeriSpeak interviews do we need in that data set for us to do a proper calibration of the non-probability opt-in sample. So that involves a trade-off discussion that we invite to have with our clients as we seek to produce the optimal calibration solution for the client, but also knowing that budget can be a constraint, and we welcome those conversations to identify the optimal balance of budget versus the rigor in the calibration routine.
Next question. Is TrueNorth only available in the United States or other countries?
Yeah, it is only available in the United States. Certainly as an organization, and particularly in the AmeriSpeak group, we specialize in customized panel building as well. And so we're always welcome to entertain building panels elsewhere.
One more question. Is there some way in which you can use the TrueNorth methodology with other probability-based surveys?
Yeah, that's absolutely doable. We've entertained applying this technique to full face-to-face interviews, to address-based samples and telephone. As long as there's a probability element and a non-probability element, we can directly apply this procedure without any hitches whatsoever.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you Mike, thank you Angela, thank you David. Those are all the questions for today. On the presenting slide, as mentioned earlier, you can see their contact information. They're happy to answer any questions via phone or email. And of course, you can visit the website to learn more. Thank you as well to all participants and Insights Association. Please stay tuned for the recap of the video of the webinar. Have a great day. Thank you.